Welcome everybody to the Agrarian Change Seminar for Spring 2024. This is the second seminar in the series this term. My name is Shreya Sinha. I'm one of the editors of the Journal of Agrarian Change and a lecturer at Queen Mary University of London. So today's seminar is also co-organized with the Center on Labour Sustainability and Global Production at Queen Mary University. And I'm University of London, and I'm joined here by co-organizers. So there's Amod Shah from ISS The Hague, Carlos Muanga from SOAS, also Elena Baglioni, who's co-director of the center, is joining us here today as well. Before we start and move to the guest, I just want to flag, as usual, that this meeting will be recorded. So if you don't want your audio or video to be recorded, please keep your camera off. But you can still, of course, use the chat function for comments and questions. Over to our seminar today. We have Dr. Jorg Novak from the University of Brasilia, who is Assistant Professor for International Political Economy at the Institute for International Relations at the University of Brasilia. Jorg's research areas are racial capitalism, logistics and infrastructure, labor in the global south, and Althusserian Marxism. And Jorg is very widely published, as I think quite a few people in the audience already know. So that's it. I think with this, Jorg, it's over to you. You have 45 minutes, after which we will have comments from a special discussant, and then we will open up to Q&A from the whole audience. So welcome, Jorg, and over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Shreya, for the introduction, and also everybody who organized it and is in the team for giving me the opportunity to presenting here. It's also a nice coincidence that the paper on which the talk is based was just published a week ago in the Global Labor Journal, which is open access, so it's easily accessible for everyone on the internet. And I just start the talk and looking very much forward to the debate. I've presented this twice only in Brazil. So it's the first time I present the paper actually in English language. And yeah, I'm looking forward, and we'll kind of share my slides here. Okay, good. Looks good. I'll just... So, global labor studies and racial capitalism. I called it a bit a missed encounter, which goes a bit back to the metaphor of encounter, which also comes from some post-structuralist and structuralist philosophy, but we don't have to dwell on that too much. So I found that in the past years, a huge debate is going on in the racial capitalism literature, which relates to labor, and in the labor studies literature, this hasn't been reflected a lot. So my aim with the paper was pretty much and principally to bring together those debates, because I think the one could profit from the other. And here it's more like from the one side, I will present more the racial capitalism side as a kind of stimulus for global labor studies to engage with the literature. This is also why I chose the Global Labor Journal as a place of publication, also because I come more from the labor studies side, so I kind of bring certain literature. And I also felt like some of the racial capitalism literature itself doesn't debate much what other people are doing in the same camp. I mean, often they know each other, but they also don't engage with one another's work. I mean, some do, others don't. So yeah, I think it's interesting to connect certain strands in the debate here. So I will have mentioned three arguments first, which I think are arguments that follow from what I present here. So, and I will only go deeper into the third one, but I'll mention the other one because it's interesting that the whole debate kind of connects to larger questions about capitalism. So we're not like going into some subsection. of reality, because I think the questions that come up with the racial capitalism debate like expand to larger questions about capitalism or connect with larger questions. So global labor studies expands the geographic scope, not only looking at North America and Europe and Australia maybe, but for global labor studies, labor movements somehow start in the late 18th century, which is weird because labor was always there. And so this is obscuring earlier forms of industrialization in other continents, but also during European mercantilism. So there are some historians who have been investigating this more, also in the last 30, 40 years already, but there's somehow in the labor studies literature, there's somehow this cutoff. So everything starts with Industrial Revolution in England and afterwards. So I think we lose a lot with this focus. Maybe we have to go back more, or at least connect more. And I think this is something what world systems theory did, but which then also like Cedric Robinson did, who was to some extent influenced by Wallerstein in going back at least to the 16th century. And so if we include these other forms of industrialization and also slavery, I think we also get a different picture. So this is something which is starting to be done. Jairus Banaji does some of that stuff and others. But I just mention it here because it also connects to this aspect. Then there's the whole question, the focus on wage labor as a central mechanism for extraction of value. This is also something that world systems theory already engaged in, saying like, okay, wage labor is central in developed capitalism, but then in the other countries, it's not that central. And I think one takeaway from the debate is that for Marx, the generality of wage labor is a characteristic of what he calls developed pure capitalism. But then Marx also acknowledges many times in Capital, for example, that this pure capitalism hardly exists empirically. So, I mean, he says there's a tendency towards this developed pure capitalism, but there's always still a mixture. And then I think that's also rather the case than in poorer countries. So the third point that I will engage with more is that I think similar to Marxism work, and Marx specifically works a lot on colonialism and racism and slavery. So these topics are part of Marx's work, but there's a lack of theorization about this. So it appears, but more as a kind of empirical phenomenon, which is important, but it doesn't go into the theoretical body. And I think that's a bit similar in labor studies. So labor studies engages with race, but it doesn't integrate it into the theoretical apparatus. So there's some kind of barrier. So I think my talk will be more in this third area. And I think the other two ones still could be developed, but I just wanted to show that the first two are kind of central questions for any interpretation of capitalism, and they follow from this racial capitalism debate. Okay, now I'm trying to move my presentation. I think I have to do it here on the screen. So back to global labor studies, which is a bit the starting point. So the good thing about global labor studies, it had this focus on informal, precarious, subcontracted work, which are forms of work which are much more important in the global south than in Europe or in the US. Racialization, as I've mentioned, as a process of segmentation of work is object of research since the 1960s. I think important authors were like Harry Braverman. It's not mentioned a lot today when there's being talked about Braverman, but it's part of his famous book, this segmentation of work into along class and gender lines and also along other lines. And Richard Edwards was somebody who like worked and then also developed the theory of segmentation in labor studies. But also here we see like racism and race rather treated as ascriptive aspects. So it remains object of empirical research without proper theorization. So it goes into this whole segmentation theory, but there's not the question like, where does it come from, this pattern of segmentation? And I think the concept of informal work, which is very central to global labor studies, contributed in the long run more to an exoticization or like discernment of the forms of regulation of informal work, because it has a purely negative definition. So everything that European industrial relations approaches don't understand with their conceptual apparatus, they call informal work, which is a bit of a intellectual laziness for me, because it's a purely negative definition. Of course, then you have like lots of empirical work on informal work where you get the details, but there's hardly any more conceptual differentiation, like types of informal work and so on. It remains with this kind of sticker, informal work. I was then also looking a bit on how race was being dealt with in global labor studies. And I was looking at some of the central authors, like Beverly Silver was very important with works like Workers in the South and North, and the book like Forces of Labor. So she looks a lot at the North-South division of the working class, but describes processes of segmentation as boundary drawing. And this remains also a bit far from any debate on racism, because she says, boundary drawing is important, but it can be done by capital, by states, or by workers. So and there's no fixed structures of boundary drawing. So on the one hand, it's a bit paradoxical, because she looks a lot at North and South and imperialism to use that framework, but racism somehow stays outside. There's Grounding Globalization, which was a work on Australia, South Korea, and South Africa. Their racism is present very much in the empirical material, but remains under-theorized. The book Global Labor Studies, which is a kind of introductory book by Marcus Taylor and Sebastian Roux. So they work already a bit more on those aspects, separate chapters, which they have on informal labor, a chapter on agrarian labor, a chapter on migrant labor, and a chapter on forced labor. But they hardly mention race or racism. So somehow some phenomena related to racism are like provided a lot of space, but then there's also no specific approach to race. So Rethinking Global Labor, another recent work by Ronaldo Munk. So he affords much more space than all the other books mentioned for imperialism, colonialism, and racism. It also goes into the whole structure of the book, the table of contents, but still racism is not central. But I would say like here we can see a lot more engagement with the topic. Then Marcel van der Linden is also interesting in his very recent work, The World Wide Web of Work. So he has a far wider historical view. He is a historian. So slavery and convict work are treated in separate chapters as precedents for modern labor management. And also he connects the abolition of slavery and the rise of indentured labor. But there's also no explicit engagement with racism. So a bit similar maybe to Munk, but with other focus. And there's one journal article by Bonacic et al. From 2018, The Racialization of Global Labor. And this article has not been cited a lot, which is interesting. Also didn't see much follow-up. So they have an interesting differentiation into primary and secondary racialization by capitalists and by workers. So I think so that was the only piece that I found in the global labor studies, which is very explicitly dealing with racialization. I mean, probably there are others, but I just wanted to give a kind of overview on major works. So we hop now to Cedric Robinson and the book Black Marxism. It was published in 1983. There has been a bit of debate in the 1980s, but not too much. Some important authors mentioned it, like Stuart Hall and some US authors also. But the debate about the book really started in 2015. So there was a conjunctural coincidence with the Black Lives Matter movement that the book became really a topic of debate, and that also racial capitalism became a term that was engaged with like more frequently. So we see a kind of belated reception of the book. Cedric Robinson passed away in 2016, so he was only starting to see this engagement. So the book has like three main theses. The first one is interesting. We can maybe debate why this was so important to Cedric Robinson. So he said racial hierarchies are not a product of the colonial conquest of the Americas and other parts of the world by European powers. So this is the thesis, which is more the mainstream thesis. Also, most of post-colonial theory holds this. But he says racism or racial hierarchies existed before the conquest within Europe, with an important basis in East European slavery. There's also the colonization of Ireland, but there's also other forms of slavery and racism. So that's interesting. I will not focus a lot here. Satnam Murdy started to work on this aspect and confirms what Cedric Robinson said. So his second thesis, and this is kind of central for us here, the first movements of workers in capitalism were the revolts of enslaved workers in mines and plantations and the maroon communities all over the Americas. So this is what Cedric Robinson calls the Black radical tradition. So he shows with a lot of historical work that he relates to, which was done by other people, but he collects all this historical work and shows there's a 400 years long tradition of this type of resistance, and that the European labor movement only came afterwards, after these 400 years. So you kind of have to explain why the European labor movement is more important than the one that came before and lasted much longer. The third thesis is not so much present, but somehow inside the book, and also this argument was made by people like Sidney Mintz before, like the plantation being the prototype for factory organization, given the serial organization of space and the processes of work, and agrarian capitalism as a kind of basis for industrial capitalism. So again, I will not go into all these theses and focus more on the second one, but will also touch on the third one a bit. So my focus here, as I said before, will be the debate after Robinson, because I think his theses are already known to some extent, but not the work that came afterwards. So one of the first ones to engage with Robinson after this period of 2015 was Nikhil Pal Singh. It's also interesting that a lot of scholars that I will mention have a background, they have like are from Asian descent, but work in the US. Yeah, maybe it's also interesting to see what is the common background. So Nikhil Pal Singh, he engages with Marx's work, the comparison of slavery and waged work. So Marx is also often putting them into contrast, but also at times underlining continuities between slavery and waged work. So there's this kind of ambivalence, these two types of contrasting them by Marx. And the starting point for Marx is that he talks about the enslavement of the waged worker, and the novelty would be that servitude has changed its form. And I think Singh makes a very interesting conclusion from this, that Marx discovered two logics of domination. One is slavery based on force and coercion, and another is waged work based on impersonal forms of domination. And I think it makes sense to kind of make an analytical separation of these two logics of domination. But then Singh's interpretation is that in empirical reality, both logics are mixed up. And this is also kind of finds its references in Marx's work. So I think that that's a very creative interpretation of this kind of contradictory mentioning how these contradictions and how Marx is comparing slavery and waged work, sometimes as different and sometimes as similar. Another very important author, Siddhant Issa, he agrees with most of what Singh says, but he criticizes one aspect, that Singh remains focused on work, is not recognizing the different forms of racial capitalism. This is an argument that also has been made by Patrick Wolf earlier on, like in the 2010s, so that focusing on the US, but you can also apply to Australia, for example, that expropriation of land of indigenous peoples and exploitation of forced work of Black people are two complementary but different processes, which also result in a different treatment of those groups, because there's a different interest. So Issa calls this colonial racial or original accumulation. So I think that's important to not only look at work, because the land question comes first, no, in the process of colonization and colonial invasion. And Issa also does make an important argument about free and unfree labor. So he says free and unfree labor are always kind of opposite poles, but there's no kind of special characteristic for any one of those. So he says in empirical reality, there's a continuum of labor regimes. This coincides with much recent work on slavery and free labor, or saying that there's no hard line. There are a lot of gray zones between both, but then in most situations, there are two groups which have better and less good conditions of work. So no, I was it was jumping the slides. So I cite here what Sidan Issa says: the Black slave, by being confined to the unfree end of the labor spectrum, gives stability and meaning to the free white male proletariat. So you always have these kind of two groups which are separated by their conditions of labor and conditions of work, and also by the legal rules which are applied to them. So, and Issa says this polarization of forms of labor facilitates alliances between capital and a part of the workers, providing the basis for the white supremacist order. So this is what he calls the basis for class collaboration in the white supremacist racial order. Of course, it's not all the workers and also not all the white workers who enter this alliance. But this kind of separation and opposition between free and unfree forms of labor provides the basis for this kind of political conditions. So Sidan Issa therefore identifies three structural continuities of racial capitalism. So he says free wage labor is defined on the basis of expropriation and exploitation of Black and indigenous populations. So we have to see like both poles again. Then these populations are also today disproportionately affected by forms of expropriation beyond capitalist exploitation of surplus labor, which can be housing issues, segmentation of the housing market, access to health, police repression. These are various other forms of expropriation. And then again, this point that the reproduction of racial capitalism is based on a cross-class alliance between capitalists and the part of the working class. And we have to see this is not only about exploitation, this issue of the cross-class alliance, it's also about social control. I think that's the second big issue that we have here. There's exploitation, but there's social control. Racism serves the social control of white people predominantly, or the people who are racially privileged. So now we are entering another strand of the debate, which I think is good because it takes a bit focus away from the Americas and the relation between Europe and the Americas, or Europe and Africa, because Asia is often a bit kind of out of the picture when there's debates about racism. So there's a number of authors, and Michal Khan is one of the important ones here, that show how after the abolition of Black slavery, Indian labor started to be framed in a different way. So before abolition, many forms of indentured labor in India were understood as forced labor. And after abolition, even the abolitionists who were writing against slavery, they started now to term it as voluntary work, which was kind of legitimating the export of millions of workers from India to other continents. I mean, Guyana, Suriname are kind of famous examples, also South Africa, later the Arab countries. So it's interesting, Walter Rodney already, this is the less famous book of Walter Rodney, The History of the Guyanese Working People, and he analyzes very much in detail how the Indian bonded labor was essential to control the demands of the former black enslaved workers in Guyana, because they, after abolition, they were free agricultural workers who would sometimes work on the farm, sometimes not, because they also had a plot of land in the village. So they were more independent. So the Indian bonded labor was very important in Guyana for the farmers to fight against the demands of the black former enslaved workers. So I think Rodney is a good example of that, provides a good example of that process. And there are immediate connections. This is the interesting thing, like the plantation owners after abolition in the Caribbean, they received reparations because they received reparations for the workers they lost, the enslaved workers, and for the plantations. And often they reinvested in India using the same personnel, the same slaveholder management personnel, the same technology. So there were a lot of books which were coming manuals about how to set up plantations, which were then brought from the Caribbean to India. So Misha Khan calls this process as layers of racialization that undergirded how labor was produced for the global capitalist order. So there was a global discourse that produces racialized labors. Suddenly there was this turn, like with abolition, black slavery was evil, but then somehow the indentured labor from India became good voluntary labor, and Khan calls this the fiction of the Indian coolie laborer as the free, self-possessed individual. Another strand of that debate is caste and racism, and here a very recent contribution from Sheetal Chabria, I forgot the year here, that's 2023, which was published in Historical Materialism. So she introduces in this kind of discourse account around caste. So Dalit activists from India argue, like, since a long time, that the caste system should be recognized as racism, while much mainstream discourse, for example, from the Indian government, frames the caste system as a unique cultural issue of India. So it has nothing to do with anything else, and that's a kind of dominant perception. So Chabria underlines the importance of recognizing local systems of racialization like caste as part of a global racial capitalism. So, and here we come back to this question of like proto-industrialization before the English Industrial Revolution. So she says there are not only European, but also South Asian origins of capitalism, and racial capitalism developed at multiple origin points. And then only later it was integrated in the imperial system when England became dominant as a global power. And so for her, she says, on the one hand, caste system existed before the colonial invasion, yes, so this is her central point, but then the longevity of the caste system is also aspect of the rule of capital and not something which is backward and cultural. So yeah, that's the point I already made. So the caste system and the mass existence of landless laborers preceded the colonial invasion, but she also puts a spot on the fact that Cedric Robinson ignored non-European forms of racism. I mean, he mentions them a bit when it comes to the slavery of black people by the Arab empires. But in more contemporary forms, Cedric Robinson doesn't engage with Asia. So the thesis then of Sheetal Chabria is that there was a large geographical spread of commercial capitalism since the 16th century, and that goes along with various local versions of racial capitalism. So she doubts a bit the thesis by Wallerstein that European capitalism was already dominant in the 16th century. And she also warns against this idea because she says there are various of these local versions of racial capitalism. She warns against the idea to see like Asian capitalists and developers as the vanguard of post-colonial liberation. Like Asian variants of capitalism have a longer history, so also this kind of maybe a certain anti-imperialism that somehow sees India and China as the new powers as kind of a liberation movements. She thinks this is misguided. So, and I think we come to one of the more famous authors among them, Gargi Bhattacharya, because she has written a whole book, Rethinking Racial Capitalism. And I think she has one of the most original contributions because she uses a bit what Robinson does, but is developing her own theory on top of it. And I think most interesting is that she points to a central relation between racialization, what we define as work and non-work, the forms of social reproduction, and the relations with nature. So the question of social reproduction also didn't come in much in the debates that I mentioned earlier. So for her, the invention of productive economy, and this is something which comes with capitalism, is a material and ideological mechanism of racialization. So how does she mean that? So she looks at forms of social reproduction and how they're being evaluated. So she says the extent to which families are able to produce productive workers in reproductive work corresponds to racialization. Racial capitalism establishes a frontier of the natural and not yet productive. So what does that mean? I mean, families who are able to produce children who then enter the labor market and become successful waged workers. So these are family forms who are kind of seen as good, and other family forms who are not able to produce these waged workers, they are seen as they are racialized and seen as kind of defective. So that's a bit her approach. And she kind of underlines the issue that proletarianization was always very unequal and fragile. So it doesn't happen in the same way in all the territories. And she understands its proletarianization, its transformation of homes and communities, making them functional for the reproduction of waged work. So other forms of social reproduction, which are independent from the market, they will always be racialized and be seen as backward. So this is the crucial link that she's making, which I think is very interesting and also leads to further questions. So also a close relation with nature, and this is often the independent producers who are not dependent on the market. This becomes a marker for racialization, not to be fit for productive work and therefore not being considered as fully human. So a last chunk of the debate I want to mention here is the debate about the plantationist scene. So that, of course, connects to the question of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene usually sees the Industrial Revolution as the point when there was an ecological rupture, when humanity started to affect the climate. There have been many critiques because it's not all of humanity. We know it's a small part, and then there's a small part who profits from it, an even smaller part. But there have been a few kind of climate biologists and so on who said the first ecological rupture comes with the colonization of the Americas because millions of the Amerindian populations died because of hunger, of bacteria, of massacres. So they died in a small period of 20 years, and that also caused climate change. Today, with the new methods, you can measure that. So that started this kind of mentioning of this topic, plantationist scene, which was started by Donna Haraway. But then the debate took another turn and was more connected to forms of labor organization, racialization, but also a complex of nature-society relations. And I think here the work of Wendy Walford is central. She wrote this article in 2020, and she's not mentioning Cedric Robinson, but comes to pretty similar conclusions. I'm just like citing, it sounds like it's immediately from the book of Cedric Robinson. The cradle of modernity is no longer the enclosures, Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution, but conquest, colonization, and forced labor in the New World, Asia, and Africa. Centering race means relocating the classic case of modernity from England to the colonies. And she then develops this question of like how the plantations come with a certain type of labor organization, but also with a kind of pattern of racialization, but also with certain nature-society relations. So this is a kind of new emerging debate, but which is also drawing a lot on the racial capitalism literature, but is making a very strong connection with the ecological question, of course. So before coming to the conclusions, I also mentioned Chris Manjapra, his piece from 2018. So we're going back to the question of the plantations. So he also shows like abolition coincides not with kind of less plantations, but with more plantations. And he calls this agricultural racial capitalism. And he shows like there are various phases when plantations expanded to certain areas. We can see here in the first phase, northeast of Brazil and the Caribbean. Then there was a strong focus on Haiti and Jamaica. Then we see this period, 1790 to 1840, maybe most interesting because we see that it starts to expand geographically. So Brazil and Cuba with a focus on sugar at that period, the US South with cotton, but then also Mauritius, Bengal, Assam, Kerala, Java with a number of products, sugar, indigo, tea, and coffee. And he also shows, similar to Michal Khan, this continuities that Mississippi plantation overseers were recruited by the East India Company to institute slave-like labor control on Indian plantations. So there's a whole transfer of knowledge, of personnel, of capital from the Caribbean to India at a certain point, and also to other places in Asia. So then we have an expansion of agricultural markets accompanied by a wave of indentured workers in 1840s to the 1870s, with a high point of the debt bondage between 19 and 1910. After the 1870s, we see an increasing concentration of plantation holdings, then expansion into Africa. And it's interesting that then he mentions, this is from the work of Manjapra, still by the 1930s, 30% of all FDI globally is in the plantation sector. And he doesn't mention the numbers for the 1950s, but is just saying in the 1950s, it was even more than 30%. So we can see, okay, not everything is plantations. I mean, that's not what we're trying to say here, but that the plantation economy remained, I don't have like numbers, contemporary numbers, but until the 1950s, a large part of what we understand as capitalism was in the plantation sector. So we are coming to close now. I think I'm at 35 minutes. So what are the research perspectives for us? So I identified like 5 points where like further work can be done. So we have this argument by Esa, the continuities in the forms of free and unfree work. So there's no specific characteristic of free and unfree work. It depends on the context. But there's always a recurring polarization between groups of workers and forms of work, with race as a central mechanism for hierarchization. We know there are other mechanisms of hierarchization. There's gender, there's qualification, and so on. But I think race is a pretty strong and important one. We have these types of alliances between white elites and white workers, and we can also in some cases substitute white for something else. It's always the racially privileged groups. But we have to look how this works in different countries, because often this is applied to the US, where we have a white majority. But then how does it work in countries like Brazil, where there's a white minority? So Brazil is just one example. We could use other countries. So how do the patterns work? I know in South Africa, there's like a much more complex categorization of racial groups than in the US or Brazil, for example. So we have to see how these alliances work in different places. Then there's the whole question, can the approach of racial capitalism be applied outside of the Americas? We saw some examples, but what about ethnic and linguistic differences in Russia and China? How does that work? Does that fit to the scheme, or is it something else? Yeah, and then the whole question brought up by Bhattacharya, the link between forms of social production with forms of racialization, calls, I think, for a strong interdisciplinary approach and demonstrates also the limits of labor studies. I think labor studies has to connect to the other disciplines to understand how that works. These definitions of work and non-work and forms of social reproduction. And also, I think the debate on the Plantationocene also motivates this interdisciplinary approach because it shows how productive organization, labor, racialization, and ecology are bound up and create certain patterns that are being repeated, no matter if we have a kind of legal slavery system or we have another system. But the same patterns of organization and social control are kind of continuing with this plantation model, and the plantation model probably had a large influence also on how we organize factory work, how we organize service work. Yeah, okay, so that's my contribution, and I'm happy to join the debate.
Thank you, York. So while everyone else gathers their thoughts, I did invite a discussant today who, unfortunately, due to an injury, cannot be here in present, but he's very kindly recorded us a short discussion for everybody who's present here. So I just want to introduce him. So our discussant is Dr. Amitabh Rai, who's Reader in Creative Industries and Arts Organization at Queen Mary and a member of the CLASP Research Center. Amit has authored several books, but his current research touches on critical management and organizational studies of the creative and cultural industries in the UK and India, and emergent conversations between post-colonial theory of creativity industries and the aesthetics of the Black radical tradition, and kind of yeah, his work his books include Rule of Sympathy, Jugaad Time, and Untimely Bollywood. So it's an interesting intervention in the agrarian studies space today. So I think Amod has the recording. So if you can just play that, Amod, thank you.
Hello, my name is Amit Rai, and I'm the respondent to Jorg Nowak's Racial Capitalism and Global Labor Studies, a Missed Encounter, which an article which I believe just appeared in Global Labor Studies. I want to thank Shreya and Elena for asking me to give this response, and for to Jorg Nowak for writing this very engaging paper. I wanted to begin with sort of where Nowak ends, and that is on page 17 with the 5 elements of a more integrated theorization of race and labor. And I thought there were several really important points. The definition of racialization as the production of better off and more oppressed workers, separate groups, the question of alliances between class fractions, and the dominant classes, the question of how racialization has been deployed as labor management for centuries, the equation of whiteness with productivity and productiveness, which overdetermines and racializes different forms of labor, including social reproduction. And of course, the important meditation on the Plantationocene in this essay, I thought was very illuminating, as the question of what is ecologically damaging is shifted to a consideration of racialized forms of labor organization. This is, I thought, a really interesting quote where the author quotes Wendy Wolford, who writes, "The cradle of modernity is no longer the enclosures, Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution, but conquest, colonization, forced labor in the New World, Asia and Africa. Centering race means relocating the classic case of modernity from England to the colonies, such that the goal is not the commodification of the factors of production, but slavery by any other name." I thought that was an illuminating quote. It's part of an overall deconstruction, I would say, of Eurocentrism and showing its constitutive exclusion. And that is, of course, African slavery and different forms of settler colonialism and administrative colonialism. This, of course, this poster is from the famous 19 1982 film by Manmohan Desai called Coolie, starring, of course, my namesake, Amitabh Bachchan, who plays a coolie, who works as a porter in the train stations, and he's, well, also a communist to an extent. Of course, in real life, he wasn't, and it was pure ideology, as they say. I thought the consideration of South Asia in this article was again quite illuminating and an important connection that was being made between Dalit labor and caste oppression in South Asia and its linking and its relation to of the experience of Afro-descendant peoples, for instance, in the Black Atlantic. And I think what was important in that was that the voices of Dalit activists and scholars were highlighted, and I thought that was very important. And I'll just sort of read bits of this quote from Sheetal Jabria. Dalit activists frequently argue that the caste system should be recognized as racism, while mainstream discourse such as the Indian governments frame it as a unique cultural and religious issue of India. I thought this point was really interesting and important. That is that racial capitalism development at multiple origin points and was only later subsumed within the European colonial frame, and that's Cabria. That I think, raises several questions about, are we talking about varieties of racial capitalism? In the sense, then in what sense is race integrated into a critique of capitalism or into critique of forms of labor regimes under capitalism? So that I thought was an important consideration, a question for me. What does this imply? This critique of racial capitalism in South Asia, racial capitalism as emerged, for instance, in the Black Atlantic. What does this imply about our understanding of the totality of the entire system of racial capitalism, and how do we understand this geographical and historical heterogeneity? I kind of wanted to finish my response by quoting from Robinson, the capitalist critique, and I think that Robinson is doing something other than or something more than only a critique of political economy. He's also developing I would call a theory of Black self-organization, or what I do call, and I have called race racing as ontologies of racial formation, rather than simply being reduced to racial capitalist critique. I think Robinson's attention to the Maroon, for instance, and the Maroon system, and what it how it challenged the plantation scene, how it challenged racial capitalism. Part of that is about the emergence of Black consciousness, the Black identity, and Black ways of life, which is what I call ontological self-organization, ontologies of self-organization. What does this imply for your essay? I think this, for me, means that we need to bring the ontological dimensions of Robinson's analysis in Black Marxism back into our discussion. And I think I'll finish by reading this quote from Robinson. Manifest expressions of Black radicalism, such as maroonage, arson, the destruction of work tools, and even open rebellion were complemented by less overt forms. When separation was not possible, open revolts might fester. Where rebellion was immediately impractical, the people prepared themselves through Obeah, Voodoo, Islam, and Black Christianity. Through these, they induced charismatic expectations, socializing and hardening themselves and their young with beliefs, myths, and messianic visions that would allow them someday to attempt the impossible. Their history confirmed these processes. Their fruition could be seen in the papilloi of the Haitian Revolution, the Obeah men and women who crowd the trial records of slave rebellions in the Caribbean and elsewhere, the Muslim revolts in Brazil, the rebel preachers who appear at the center of resistance in Jamaica, Suriname, and North America. Through it all, of course, the perturbations of the world system constituted the parameters, the conditions of being of Black resistance. I think of these words as I recall or remember what is happening right now in Gaza and Palestine, the West Bank, and what this essay has to teach us about forms of racial capitalism in these different historical contexts. Thank you very much. I will hopefully send you specific questions that you can then maybe hopefully follow up in the conversation. But that's it for now. Thank you very much.
So Amit isn't here too, so I can thank him here. But I mean, he didn't send the questions. But in fact, I think the questions were kind of there in the discussion. He was asking about the varieties of racial capitalism, the question of ontology, and yeah, and I wonder, Jorg, if you want to respond to any of this or any of his comments or questions, and for everyone else in the audience, please feel free to raise your hand or ask a question in the chat while Jorg is answering that. Thanks. You're on mute, Jorg.
On mute. I put myself on mute now. I unmute. So I think there's an interesting tension in the work of Cedric Robinson, because on the one hand, we also saw it a bit from the citations. He's kind of saying that African people who revolted in the Americas had a kind of different sense of civilization, although they came from very different parts of Africa and often were groups that are mixed up, which was also a strategy of rule to mix up people from different areas who speak different languages. On the other hand, he says that the racialism was a kind of European product. It was an inter-European racism first. So he doesn't have this idea that it's always against Black or brown people. So racism can be against white people. So this is, and he had a lot of, like Cedric Robinson had a lot of contact with Irish radicals when he wrote the book. He was part of the time in London when he wrote the book. And I think that's one of the strands why he emphasized the question of the inter-European racism. And so it's a bit, it would be good if Amit would be here so I could ask him more about this ontological dimensions, because it's a bit hard to, that's a point that is a bit hard to nail down in the work of Cedric Robinson. Because he says, yeah, there's a different civilization idea, different civilizational basis. There are also very many concrete examples, like the Maroon communities, which would be the form of workers' organization of those people who fled from slavery. But then also Robinson himself mentions that the Maroon communities, and this is like backed up by the historical research, were often mixed up from white, indigenous, and Black people. I mean, a lot were Black people who fled from slavery, but these were also not kind of communities which were closed to other racial groups, or however we want to call this. So this tension between saying, okay, there's a different civilizational project, but at the same time, racism and skin color is not identical. So, and this is where we enter into this varieties of racial capitalism. How does that work then? And when Asia comes into play, or even when Europe comes into play, we have to talk about Eastern European racism, like gypsies were also victims of slavery until the late 19th century, at the time when slavery was abolished in one of the last countries to be abolished, in Brazil. So, but then Eastern European slavery also, not only against gypsies, also was lasting until the early 19th century. So we have different patterns. We have like 10 million enslaved workers during Nazi Germany, which were all from Eastern Europe. So how do we explain that? And that goes back to this longer pattern of exploitation of Eastern Europeans in Germany, which didn't start with fascism, of course, which was going on before. There's the famous inaugural lecture of Max Weber, where he talks about Polish immigrants and their low culture threatening German cultural values. So, I mean, there's a whole history also of inter-European racism, which disconnects a bit the question of race from skin color. Yeah, so I just see that there are like tensions in this kind of ontologies. It's a bit of an open question for me, because of course racism is not disconnected from skin color, but in some instances it can be. So
Thanks, Jorg. Does anyone in the audience have a question? This very quiet audience.
yeah, we also don't have to continue the debate on that point, which I mentioned. We can also like reconnect with the labor question.
Yeah, I think Elena has a question. Yes. Okay, Elena, please go on.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
sorry, this is a bit of a blunt question and maybe too broad, but do you think that race operates differently in these theories than other axes of forms of hierarchies in capitalism that have emerged historically? And you mentioned, I think, sometimes in your somewhere in your presentation, gender. So, you know, patriarchy was there too before capitalism, but then gets harnessed, shaped and changed by capitalism. Do you think it's different from that? It's another axis. Or it stands at a different level in the totality of capitalism than gender or other axes of difference?
Yeah, I think there's one specific issue with race, that it's always kind of working analogous to the geoeconomic hierarchy between different territories. So I think that's a kind of special feature. So this can be between continents, of course, like Europe dominated a lot of parts of the world at a certain point, and then these parts of the world, the populations from these parts of the world became racialized. But it also within Europe, like Eastern Europe, was economically backward, and that was the basis for the racialization of Eastern Europeans. It can also occur within a country, like a certain region is very poor and then gets racialized. So there's always a connection with this kind of economic hierarchies and the populations which come from these territories being racialized. So I think that's a special feature. So we can even see that sometimes within a national state. In Brazil, this happens a lot because like the North is being seen as more like indigenous and less civilized. So I was in Sao Paulo and going to some city in the North, which I know well because I was living there. And then people said, "Wow, what are you doing there? The traffic there is like in Africa." I mean, so you hear these analogies about certain places within Brazil from other people from the south of Brazil. So I think that happens a lot also in other countries, depending on the territory, but it's always connected with the kind of question, or like people coming from different countries that immigrate. If you immigrate from a richer country, you are mostly seen as not being racialized in an inferior manner. So I think that's special. And I think the different hierarchies operate in different forms. I think gender operates in a very different form. Of course, it combines often with racialization, and then this has specific effects when the two characteristics or hierarchies are combined. Yeah, but I try to think of an example where this like kind of economic hierarchies don't apply to racism, but yeah, there can be linguistic or religious differences, which can also be motivation for race, and this maybe not always has to do with economic differences. But I think in most cases that I can think of, I mean, sometimes this overlaps, like in the question of Ireland, there was also a religious and language question, but then it was also clear that Ireland was poorer than England, or less economically developed in the terms that were used at the time. Yeah, thanks a lot for the question.
Thanks. Anyone else? Steve, is that, yeah? Yeah, do you want to unmute it, Steve? Yes, thanks.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
good. Thank you for really interesting. This is not my subject. A question I have though is there's a lot of contemporary literature on empire, looking at history of empire, and you haven't mentioned empire this evening. So I was wondering how your literature overlaps with some of the contemporary work on past and contemporary empires.
Yeah, I think it's an important aspect. Some of the work does mention it. I didn't mention it in the talk, like for example, Mishal Khan, who talks about abolition, and then the Indian workers, the bonded workers. She says that all this whole transfer of machinery and technology and knowledge about running plantations, like the British Empire was central for intermediating the circulation, because these were kind of often plantations run by British colonialism in Jamaica, for example, and other places in the Caribbean. While at the same time, India was also part of the British Empire. So the British Empire was kind of the medium that facilitated the circulation of this knowledge, capital, and so on. I mean, also part of them were kind of these.
That's sort of the contemporary empires, but empires go back to Roman Empire, the European empires, and we're now seeing a resurgence possibly of the Russian empires. They are all in parallel, in a sense, to your analysis.
Yeah, I think in the literature that I saw, most reference was to the British Empire. I mean, we know there were other imperial powers like France and Portugal, who were also important for the colonization of the Americas, for example. I'm not much an expert on the Russian Empire, because also the literature I read didn't touch on the Russian Empire. But I think the age of empires, as you call it, this was an important aspect of.
But I think some of your argument is we need to look beyond the contemporary empire of Britain, back to previous, and back to the role of race in previous societies. And that's where perhaps where I think some of the people writing on empire are saying we need to look back further than the contemporary British Empire or Dutch empires to earlier, and those to some extent have been underanalyzed, or their lessons or their functionings unrecognized in the literature which foregrounded just the British Empire.
Yeah, I agree with that. I saw some of that literature coming out. I didn't have the time to really go in depth into that literature, but I kind of know that there's a wave of scholarship on that, on the earlier empires and how they kind of prefigured the British Empire. I think somebody who does a bit of that work is Geraldine Heng. She wrote an important book just like 2 or 3 years ago on how race was constituted in the Middle Ages and how this was also working together with several empires. She focuses more on the European ones, but not only on the British. I mean, her first chapter is about the expulsion of the Jews in the 13th century from England, but then she has other chapters with other aspects. I think she does do a bit of the connection of these earlier empires and racialization. But I'm really keen to learn more about this literature.
Thank you. You've filled in a whole lot for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Jörg. Thanks, Steve. So we have Carla and then Devika. So Carla, if you could just unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yes. Thanks for your presentation, and following Elena's question, I would also like to ask you about indigenous communities, how that access is being bound up, or specifically to racial hierarchies and racism, because we sometimes see that many of the things that you mentioned in how those racial hierarchies are being built as not desirable for market, we can also see them being played with indigenous communities. Is it a different thing?
No, I don't think so. It applies. I think there's a larger group. I mean, I speak like from the Brazilian background. There's a larger group in Brazil which is now called traditional communities. So this would include the indigenous communities, which are maybe around 2 million people in Brazil, like 1% of the population, which is 200 million, about, more or less. And so traditional communities would be everybody who's kind of who's working with nature and staying on a traditional territory, doing fishing or collecting fruits, who's not doing agriculture. So these would be about like 12 million people in Brazil. So these would be more or less those people who still do what was often called subsistence economy. And I mean, it's a bit weird term. So this is why traditional communities is now being used as a kind of more positive term. And there's a lot of this idea these people are not developed and so on, while in reality, these are often the people who protect the forest and maintain the forest, which is a kind of forest or water areas, which many live also on the coast and do like small scale fishing and so on. So I think a lot this applies to these communities. And I think the specific thing that Isa was mentioning about indigenous communities, and this is work which was done by Patrick Wolf. So Patrick Wolf shows how in the US, for example, there was always the exclusion of Black workers, because this was a smaller population, like 10% more or less of the US population, which was exploited. While for the indigenous population, and the same was done in Australia, there was more the intention to assimilate them. So it was, and this was also done a lot in Brazil. So they were kind of forcing marriages between indigenous communities and white and Black persons, because they wanted to destroy and dilute the culture, because they were interested in the territory. So there was a different policy, for example, in the US, like Black people were rather excluded and said, okay, you are Black and we want you to stay Black. While with the indigenous populations, there was more the kind of impetus to dilute this community by marriage. And this is what happens today. Like most people in Brazil are from indigenous heritage, but officially it's 1%. So it's a different way of kind of trying to destroy the culture, the language, and so on, the identity. Because also in the end, the indigenous communities, they have nothing in common, except for the fact that they were in the Americas before, or in other continents. I mean, they have many differences, old struggles between themselves, old oppositions. In Brazil, there's a huge division between two indigenous larger organizations, which has to do with old regional divisions and so on. So, I mean, one also has to see they're being kind of lumped together into this category, indigenous communities. just because they were there before. I mean, it's also many people like from the indigenous communities in Brazil are being white, and then they are not being recognized as being indigenous because it doesn't fit the stereotype, but they were always light-skinned. So it has a lot of dimensions.
Mhm. Thank you.
Thanks, Carla. Thanks. Devika. Yes.
Hi. Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was quite intrigued by the way you kind of talked about racialized labor and then and plantations, and then kind of at the later part of your presentation, you kind of jumped us towards looking at how plantation was seen as a conceptual framework has come up and has been worked on, which kind of looks at the ecological, the production relations, and racialized labor, like holding these three axes together. But through your work, you kind of kept going towards the plantation as a site of contestation, which so I was also wondering, it's a two-part question on how you're understanding kind of these framings for your work as well. So one is in terms of in terms of how plantation as a conceptual framework, because the genealogy of plantation as a conceptual framework, which does talk of the ecological extractivist nature, production relations, and working on a particular land and area as racialized labor works towards, and how plantation time, plantation outside, these frameworks, there's like the genealogy of literature which kind of looks towards it, and then the plantation scene comes as a conceptual framework here, which you're bringing in, which is because you're kind of engaging with work that's happening right now in the plantation. But for your work on which kind of wants to talk of racialized labor and production relations, the concept of plantation as a all-encompassing racialized, capitalized kind of system of working, which is an universalized unit of production in its own self, especially because you're also talking about labor in the global south and caste and labor in India specifically as well. And then you've talked about tea and coffee production in India, and not extensively, but there's the work that happens with regard to that. So I was also wondering in terms of the use of concept that you're doing with regard to racialized, capitalized labor, and how would say a concept of plantation scene would be different than using the genealogy of literature on plantation studies, especially with regard to the Caribbeans and Americas as well, and also of course the global south, how those kind of framing of that, how you're working towards it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I think this term plantation is seen, on the one hand, it's working a bit as a metaphor, but it's not just a metaphor, it's also kind of pattern of organization. So where you see like a certain relation to nature, a certain work organization, this kind of serial large-scale organization, with also kind of serial housing, which was done. Also, many of the methods of labor management, like counting the time that a certain labor process is taking, which was always seen like, oh, Ford invented that, but that was already used in the 17th century in plantations. So they were measuring the time, how long people need to do this or that. So it seems that like all these different elements, they are always coming together in a package, and it's difficult to kind of uncouple them. So let's do a plantation without serial organization, or let's do a plantation without racialization. So it seems like this kind of different elements are always coming together. So this is a kind of a bit the thesis of the plantation as seen, like a certain way of racialization, organization of work, relation to nature, they got coupled together in this package. So it's a kind of a package deal. So you can't, it seems to be difficult to unpack these different elements unless you do a kind of a certain rupture, like small scale farming or something, which follows a different logic. So I think that's a bit the idea. And I think what's good about this debate is that it brings together various strands that have been debated separately. Of course, there's work on plantations since 50, 60 years by a lot of people. There's work on indentured labor, like also since a long time. I saw like Jan Bremen was joining the talk. He's one of the most important authors on indentured labor, for example. But then he was not like read by many people on racialization and so on. So I think so this plantation scene debate has this positive aspect of bringing together like these various strands which are connected in this plantation logic.
Thanks, Devika, for your question. So, Jorg, there's a question in the chat, and then I have a question of my own. So Bhupendra is asking, how do you see the epistemologies of racial capitalism, which is unfolding through artificial intelligence in the form of neocolonialism? I don't know if you is that kind of clear, the question, or maybe Bhupendra is on the chat, he can.
Yeah, no, the question is clear. I also saw that before in the chat. So I don't know if I'm able to answer a lot because I'm not very expert on artificial intelligence. I read some of the stuff about this algorithmic racism, which is also a kind of new field of study, how like certain racial hierarchies are being reproduced by this like algorithmic management and so on. And probably we will see the same thing with artificial intelligence, because many things are based on certain cultural contexts that are being developed. These are kind of Microsoft is the leading developer, is more or less the company that funds ChatGPT. Of course, this comes with a certain concentration. I mean, we see like most of the big tech companies are based in the US. But then interestingly, Microsoft has a larger number of partnerships with Chinese companies, which the others don't have, which Google, Facebook, and so on don't have. So I mean, and then Chinese companies are probably the second one, but this also means like there will be a kind of certain bias. So of course, we will see some concentration of power and expectations in artificial intelligence along where these main companies are based. But I'm not sure I can respond much beyond this because it's not really my area of expertise.
Okay, thanks. So I will ask a question. In case anyone else has a question, please feel free. We can come back to it after mine. So again, this is not quite my area, but I'm just your paper is an intervention in kind of advancing global labor studies, or adding to the, I guess, the scholarly agenda, and to like center racial capitalism in that, and vice versa, I suppose. And I think this is maybe a little bit tangential, but just from my own familiarity with work in India. So there is a lot of historical and contemporary literature on kind of trying to combine class and caste, and labor and caste, and of course also gender and all. But at the moment, since we're talking about a caste and a race and caste and so on, so I'm just saying that there is of course a large amount of literature which is not framed in these terms, but there is this literature, and I just and this has been, I suppose, a recurring question also in the agrarian studies field, like how do you combine the two, and I think there is a I'm wondering what is your take on it? What is your take on how to combine? I don't know whether you have a view on how to combine these, or if it's because there are people, like recently there has been the application of the term conjugated oppression, this kind of which again came from Philip Bourgois in the American context, and this idea that these identities and the class and these other identities, they are co-constitutive, right? But there is also another view that yes, they are co-constitutive in if you look at things within production, but there is something about caste or race which is which is just about reproducing social stigma, and which lies beyond the sphere of kind of productive relations and kind of life, kind of the existence of people as a whole, and kind of beyond economic subjects, and Jaisil and Raj, who was giving us who works on tea plantations in India, and who gave a talk in our series last term. He actually talks about it as categorical oppression, that it's something else because it's really an oppression and a kind of social stigma that exists, you know, that and the experience of stigma for these groups that exists beyond the production. And I don't know if you have a take on this, on how to combine, or is it just that it would be enough for these fields and disciplines to be advanced through some intersection, or I don't know. So I don't know if that's a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
I don't think you can make much progress in like doing this as a kind of purely theoretical debate. I think this is why like much of the post-structuralist debate on race, class, gender, which was happening in the 90s, 2000s, didn't advance much because they were often very much focused on sorting it out at a level of theory, which is understandable to some extent. It's also kind of ironically trying to find the universal theory that postmodernism didn't want to have, but then you remain at the level of theory. But I think, in fact, if you combine the empirical research with its theoretical conclusions, I think you can make progress. And I think this is why I was using also this type of literature, like the work that Michal Khan does, that Manjapra does, like showing how the different dimensions combine in empirical fashion. I think that leads us to make like better theorization, how the things come together. I don't think we will find a kind of perfectly fitting theoretical scheme which adapts to all the empirical cases, how like different oppressions work together, because it's also changing. I mean, it's conjunctural. And I think, yeah, I mean, one aspect that I didn't mention is like kind of combining also agrarian studies with other studies, because also agrarian or rural studies were very often kind of treated as a separate area. This is why there are also separate journals and so on. And labor studies often didn't engage with rural issues at all. I mean, labor is always something urban. It's also more recent that labor studies is also kind of more looking at rural workers and so on. And I think mainly it is a bit of these things that I said in the first two slides, like we have to broaden on the one hand the geographical perspective, but also the historical perspective. I think the broadening of the geographical perspective has already happened to some extent, but I think also broadening the historical perspective, which is also a bit the call of Sheetal Chabria, saying like, yeah, we have to look at the other origins of capitalism. There's not like this one origin in England. I mean, there was a kind of this merchant capitalism since this 14th or 16th century in Europe, which already brought some constellations, but then we also have to look how this was playing out in other territories. I think this will provide us for some answers and insights to theorize further. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for that. I think if there are no other questions, I think we can bring this to a close and just thank Jorg for his very stimulating discussion. Thanks to everyone who joined us for this event. And just to say that our next seminar has actually had to be rescheduled and advanced to the 21st of February. It will be on the political economy of the agrochemical complex in China by Yunnan Su at ISS The Hague. It'll be a hybrid event. So I hope many of you can join for that as well. So thanks everybody. Thanks Jorg. Yes.
Yeah, thanks everybody for listening and asking.
Yes. Thanks. Bye.